Biswadip Gogoi is working as a research person academic at National Translation Mission, CIIL. He has been associated with various translation and localization projects on popular products from Microsoft Corporation, Samsung Electronics, Xiaomi, etc. He was part of the research team that produced more than 30 half-an-hour documentaries on different ethnic communities in Sikkim. Till now, he has translated 3 titles: Structure and Function in Primitive Society by A.R. Radcliffe Brown, Caste in Modern India and Other Essays by M.N. Srinivas, and Outlines of Linguistic Analysis by Block and Treasure from English into Assamese. His research interests include cultural studies, culture and translation, translation and localization. Now I invite Biswadip Gogoi to deliver his lecture. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mukibur and the team. As you can see, the topic is culture, choice, and translation. So if you see the slide, first slide, you will see some pictures, right? This left-hand picture, it is a delicacy. Mostly you can enjoy in South Asian countries like China, Thailand, Indonesia, Laos, Cambodia, etc. So this dish is a delicacy there, and the name is sanjiir or something like that. I am not sure how it is pronounced in Chinese or other languages. Then in the right hand side you can see 3 pictures. So the top one is, it's a silkworm. Second one is a egg of a specific ant, and third is a snail. This is not the oyster one, but this is a different kind of snail. So this silkworm, I belong to Assam. So Assam, we use it extensively. We eat it. And the second one, that ant egg, that is also used in Assam. And snail is also used some part of Assam as well as in Arunachal and other northeastern states. So when I actually show these pictures to people and ask them to react it, they react something like that. Okay, how this can be eaten? This is all this. We cannot think of these things as edible things like that. So when I came to Mysore, this is my own experience actually. When I came to Mysore, I got to know that Mysore is very famous for silk. Then I asked one of my friend. Then Mysore produces quite a lot of silk. Actually, in fact, it is the biggest silk producing place in India. That Noni silk, it is called. So I asked my friend, okay, you produce a lot of silk. So what do you do with the pupa? This thing you can see in the picture. So you must be eating it. What kind of recipe you prepare? I asked my friend. Then she said that, have you gone mad? How can you think of actually eating this? We simply throw it. We extract the silk threads, and then that pupa will be thrown. I said that no, I can't think of throwing it. I don't believe even, that this pupa will be thrown away, because these are very, very protein-rich food, and no sensible civilization or a society can actually waste this much of protein, natural protein. So these things must be used in somewhere. Can you find out for me? I asked her. Then after a couple of calls and here and there inquiries, she found out that these pupas are actually sold in bulk to these packaged food makers, especially biscuit producers and cake producers like that. So they will be grinding it, and they will be mixing with the batter or something like that, and they will prepare biscuits or cakes or such kind of things. So these things actually are quite healthy, and these are used. But we always tend to react to something that we believe is not logical, quote and unquote, the logical. So this thinking, that we all have an opinion, right? Just now I have seen that previous session, there is a very nice discussion. There is a discourse actually. So we all have our opinion, and this opinion is not bad if we actually tend to be within the limit of the discussion. This can be really, I mean, helpful for all of us. But this kind of opinion creates a kind of concept that is called ethnocentrism. In culture studies, this is a very common concept. Ethnocentrism is that we tend to measure everything. We tend to tag something good, bad, logical, illogical, doable, not doable, acceptable, unacceptable, everything. We try to actually label everything. We try to scale everything, measure everything in terms of our own cultural belief, cultural practices. And then say, oh, this should not be done, this should be done, these values and all abstract ideas. So this is ethnocentrism. So why I talk about ethnocentrism is that actually, as a translator, yeah, I always agree that we cannot get rid of this ethnocentrism within us. It will be there somewhere, it will pop up. But as a translator, it will be very important for us to actually get rid of this as much as we can. And the opposite of ethnocentrism is cultural relativism. Here we are a bit more open. I would not say that 100% open. Probably we cannot be unless we are God. Here in cultural relativism, we are a bit open. We say that, okay, I may not be eating it, I may not be doing it, I may not be wearing it. But if somebody else is wearing, he may have his own logic, he may have his own necessity. That's why they are doing it. So it is okay. So I'll not simply say that, okay, I mean, that should be banned, this should be dumped, like such kind of thing. So these two opposing concepts in cultural studies, ethnocentrism and cultural relativism, is quite important for translator, because as a translator, we should be actually trying to be more culturally relative. We should be accepting, because when we take up a text for translation, definitely the text belong to a culture, and the target will be belonging to another culture. So there will be a mixing, or there will be a transition between two cultures. So we have to, and the two culture will definitely have differences as well as similarities. So unless we can respect those differences as well as the similarities we accept, we will not be able to do a justice in the translation. Okay, this ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. With this concept, we can actually quite well connect the idea of choice. We all have choice. I like to wear this kind of dress. You like to wear that kind of dress. You like some specific dishes. Your family member like to have some other kind of dishes. These kind of things are always there. We all have our own choices. So this is a now, I mean, quite a well talked, well discussed topic in the West. India also it is there. A lot of discussion is happening on choice. So the question is, more choice, more freedom, more welfare. Is it true? Can we say that if you have more choice, does it mean that you have more freedom, and then it is ultimately can lead to a more welfare? Can we say like that? This is a tricky question, because Barry Schwartz, an American psychoeconomist, he wrote a book, The Paradox of Choice. And in that book, if you can see the cover page here, he says that this idea of choice, having lots of choices, I mean, to give you an idea that, okay, you are choosing, not somebody else is choosing for you. He calls that idea as an official dogma in Western industrial countries. Because you go to a mall, you stand in front of a big rack of biscuit, hundreds of varieties of biscuits, and you will only pick up one or two. Then you will come back. Then while eating it, you will be always thinking that, oh, you should have picked up another one, right? So it may not always actually, I mean, provide you that satisfaction. So of course, having more choice has some positive point, but here this is a, I mean, negative connotation in that sense. Actually, by providing you a lot of choices, impression has been given to you that, okay, you have more freedom to choose, and that will ensure that, okay, I mean, more welfare will be done. But Barry Schwartz have a different opinion. He has some nice talk in YouTube and all. You can actually, I mean, browse it and check it. So if you can see the picture, I think it is too small to see, maybe. The subtitle of his book is Why More is Less. He said that more is always less. So more choices are good or bad? This is a tricky question, because we always say that, oh, we don't have choices. Somebody else is deciding for us. My teacher is deciding what I should write, what I should read. My father and mother is deciding what I should eat, what I should wear. My society is imposing different rules on me. Okay, what should be acceptable social norms and what should not be. This society will again determine if you have a caste system in your society, then they will say that, oh, you should not marry a girl from that caste. This caste only you should marry. Those kind of social rules and regulations will be there. So you may think that you don't have choices, but if everything is thrown open to you, you have given more choices. Will that be really good or bad? But Barry Schwartz says that more choices can cause us paralysis, not liberation. So I'm sure you will have a different opinion, and it can be discussed in detail today or maybe sometime later. But he gives a very interesting perspective on it, and you can find about him in YouTube or TED platform, TED, Technology, Entertainment and Design platform. He says that more choices actually can lead to more expectations, and then it will lead to unhappiness. As I said, that when you stand in front of a rack of biscuit, you will buy 2 packets out of 100 varieties. You will come back to your home, you will eat, and then you will always think that, oh, you should have picked up that other 2, not these 2. So you will be unhappy, really. Then there is another scholar, Sheena Iyengar. She is also a psychoeconomist. She has given a TED talk, and in that talk, she actually highlighted a experiment, and there she tried to show that how choice influenced the performance. If I do something of my liking, I'll perform well. That is what she wants to say. If somebody force you to do something, then you may not perform that well. But if you are really doing something you are liking, then definitely you'll be, I mean, performing better according to that. I'll not go into the details of this study, the experiment. That also you can find in the TED platform. So we'll directly come to the idea of culture. So this is a very tricky thing, because what is culture? If anybody asks me, or even I think you, nobody will be able to answer. But we all know what culture is, right? But for just understanding, we can say that it's a system of shared learned values and norms of a society or of a social group. Here, values are abstract ideas about good, bad, right, desirable. These are not, in fact, very concrete ideas. For a society, what is good, for another society, that may be bad. For a society, what is edible, for another society, that may be something, I mean, you cannot even touch, it's untouchable. So in that way, these are completely abstract ideas. And a social group decides on it, and then they follow. There is no logic on it, that, okay, this is actually good, universally good. There is no such things. Then norms, social rules and guidelines. Okay, what should be done, what should not be done. All kind of appropriate behaviors in a specific social occasion. What should be your behavior? How you should treat the elders, and how you should treat your youngers. All kind of things. So mixing up, collection of all these values and norms, we can loosely call culture. But yeah, culture is something that cannot be probably defined in very certain terms. Then there are other terms, we will not get into that. Then there is folk culture, popular culture, mass culture. Just to give you touch upon, I'll say that folk culture is something a very, a folk group performs or folk group practices. Then popular culture, that same folk culture, when it became popular among the masses. Suppose to give you an example that you may have heard about the Bihu. Bihu is a famous agriculture festival in Assam. Bihu was initially a folk culture because only the peasants, it's a peasant celebration. So when they were celebrating, the peasants were celebrating, it was a folk culture. Then after that, what happened? It became very popular among the common masses, others, peasant as well as others. So it became popular culture. Then now it became mass culture. Mass culture also has a, kind of capitalism connotation. So then capitalism captured it, as it is said. Capitalism cultured it, and it is now completely used for marketing, business. So many corporates, many businessmen actually draws profit from this culture, Bihu. So it became mass culture. Then there are some other concepts like high culture, low culture. High culture is something, a culture of the very elite, which is always propagated, promoted, because money is there to actually, spend in propagation of this culture. And low culture, which is not very much promoted. And there is another term, subculture. Subculture is something, how do I say that? Okay, now something is popular, some culture is popular, but against that culture there will be a small group of people, they will be starting another kind of opposing culture to it. That is subculture. Okay, I can bring a this one, maybe kind of very prominent, this one, like how do I say? I don't know whether to bring some political examples or not, but anyway, leave it. We'll not make it political in that sense. So subculture is something that opposes the trending popular culture, which is being used by the people, which is being accepted by the people, which is popularized among people in a particular time. Opposing to that, there will be a small group of people, probably will, or it will slowly spread, of course. They will start a culture, and that is called subculture. Then there is another interesting concept proposed by Anthony Pym. Anthony Pym he's a very famous scholar of cultural studies as well as translation. He proposed a concept called interculture. Interculture talks about the beliefs and practices found in intersections or overlaps of cultures, where people combine something of two or more cultures at once. Actually, you see, previously what happens, people who were residing in very small groups, we all were tribes. There was a time we all were tribes. We were residing in small groups and remotely. We are not much connected, but now we are all connected, and the line that differentiates our societies or our social groups are very thin. So now what is happening, this lot of this what Anthony Pym calls interculture is growing. You can actually see in those intersections and overlaps of culture, there will be a new kind of culture will be growing, and these cultures will take elements or traits from neighboring cultures. There may be 2, 3, 4, or even more. So Pym says further, to avoid hasty assumptions of monoculture, I propose that culture to be left undefined as the area where we have most to discover. Then he says that more exactly, individual cultures can be defined by negotiation, not as the sources and targets of texts, but as the resistance to the movement of text from one translation to another. So he tries to actually define culture with the help of translation. And what we can do, we can actually alter this. alter this and actually try to define the translation with the help of culture. That also you can do. What he says that you pick up a text for translation, then you are translating that text to another language. So these two languages, source and target, both have their own culture. So while you will be translating a text from one culture to another, you will find the resistance. That resistance may be anything. It may be terminology, it may be concept, it may be context, anything. That what I said, that good, bad, acceptable, unacceptable, everything. And that resistance will actually help you to define individual cultures. Then only you can say that, oh, these cultures are different, and we can actually differentiate it like that. Then we'll come to the cultural turn in translation. Initially, actually, translation was regarded to be only a linguistic activity. But in 1980s, Susan Besnet and Andre Lefebvre, they actually started the paradigm, that cultural turn in translation. And they said that no, I mean, culture also plays a very crucial role. In fact, it plays the most important role in translation. And the translation debates now no longer about how to translate. It has shifted to three factors. That is who, why, and when. So now nobody talks about how to translate, because of course we all know that nobody can tell you how to translate, because we all have our own idea about how to translate, and we all are right. But now the debate is all about who, why, and when. Who is translating? Why a text is being translated, and when it is being translated, the timing. Probably yesterday Aditya Kumar Panda was talking about that. Then Susan Mishra also was talking about this kind of ideas, the politics of translation. Why a particular text is picked up, then there will be timing set up for publication, or even movie is made, then the movie will be released in a specific time, because there are regions, and these regions are very important while you actually try to understand and discuss about a specific translation. For example, I can give you like one example from Assam again, that you must have heard about Srimanta Shankardeva. Srimanta Shankardeva, he was a propagator of New Vaishnavism in Assam. And lot of literature he has actually written or translated. This is the typical problematic question, because he has taken a lot of information from Bhagavad Gita and other Sanskrit texts, and then he has actually write it down in Assamese. Some people say that this is a translation, some people say that this is transcreation, some people say that this is adaptation. This is another topic. But he has done it because he wanted to kind of bring all the ideas of Vaishnava Bhakti movement, from the pan-Indian Bhakti movement to the new Vaishnavite movement in Assam. So he didn't create anything as such, but he took all the concept of Bhakti movement and then added some local element to it, the local cultural traits to it. Then he has actually compiled or written so many books, so many even plays. So it is very important when you see a translation or discuss a translation to actually consider these 3 points: who is translating, why is translating, and when it is being translated, the timing. Actually, context became more crucial in explaining or comprehending a translation. And translation is an ideological reproduction of the source text. This point is also yesterday cropped up and it was discussed. Because as I said in the beginning, we all are opinionated. We all have our own opinion. We all have our own ideology. So when we will be picking up a text and translating it, our ideology will reflect some some way or other in the translation. We cannot avoid it. Knowingly or unknowingly, we may do it intentionally also, but it may not be intentional also sometimes, but it will be there. So translation is an ideological reproduction of the translator. So therefore, the meaning in the translation goes beyond the meaning of the source language text. So what is said in source language, that will be said, or it may not be said, but beyond that also there will be a lot of other things that will be said in the translation. We'll directly come to the concept of cultural word. Peter Newmark, he introduced a term called cultural words. And he says that this is something, I mean, when you translate a text, this target language reader may not understand some of the term used in the source text, because these are very much culturally embedded terms. So he calls these terms as cultural words, and he has actually, I mean, categorized it into five parts. One is ecology, then material culture, then social culture, then organizations, customs, activities, procedures, and concepts, and gesture and habits. So he says that these terminologies, whatever these terminologies are, these will be very tough, and we have to actually be very careful about it, because source language texts will be belong to a different culture, and these terms will be from that specific cultures. So if I am translating an English book, I face a lot of problems, because some plants, they name it, I don't know what that plant is called in Assamese. So he says that these things we have to be very careful, and we have to do a lot of preparation. Then he goes on proposing two methods of actually translating these kind of words. So how you do that as a translator? How we approach these kind of cultural words and notion? So Newmark proposes two methods. One is transference. Transference, it means gives local color, keeping the cultural names and concept. Here the local is actually the source. He says that keep those things as it is. I mean, don't change it to the target culture or target language things, so that the target audience also will know about the source culture and about those flora, fauna, and other things. Then another method is componential analysis. Here he said that you can exclude all the culture and highlight the message. What the text want to say, you just convey. Don't bother about all these things. You may bring examples from your own culture, the target culture, and embed with it. But here message is the main. Then Venuti also suggested similar kind of two strategies. One is domestication and another is foreignization. So domestication, what we do? Domestication dominating TL culture, target language culture. So wherever we find it okay, or wherever we think that okay, reader will be more comfortable, there we bring more target language cultural elements and embed with the translation. And foreignization, we keep it as it is in the source language. The idea is to that people should know about through the translation. Like just last session, Dr. Gitanjali was discussing about travelogues. So travelogue, what happened? You come to a country and then you write about the country. So you want the reader to know about the other country, right? Not your country. So by actually foreignization is something like that. I mean, you want to know people, the reader, about the culture, I mean, in where the source language is created. So by reading your translation, people will know about some other cultures. So that is the idea of foreignization. Then while talking about globalization and translation, Nico Wiersema mentioned that target text can be written in more foreignizing manner, wherein culturally bound elements are not translated. it helps learning and understanding foreign culture. So there are different approach, different opinion how to actually approach a translation, whether to keep the cultural terms intact or whether to actually, I mean, completely replace with the target culture terms. So as a translator, ultimately, everyone has to choose for them. Nobody is going to choose. So then I just want to talk about one example here. You can see the second point. There is a term called Bhuta Radhane. Bhuta Radhane actually is a ritual. Okay, you can find it in coastal Karnataka, in the Udupi or South Kannada district. This Bhuta Radhane, when actually these European missionaries and others came, then they have translated this word Bhuta Radhane as a devil worship. Bhuta Aradhane. Aradhane is worship. So Bhut means devil. That's how it was translated. Then actually I have experienced this ritual. Actually, this has nothing to do with the devil. This is a typical Indian tradition of worshipping the ancestral spirits. In lot of societies in India, actually we have our own family god, family deities, and among the family gods and deities there will be our ancestors, and these spirits will be, I mean, worshipped in a specific time or a specific day or a date or something. And in South Canada, this typical ritual Bhuta Radhane is actually meant to do that. And but a lot of people, especially European and a lot of Indians also, Indian scholars has translated it as a Bhuta Radhane, is a devil worship, which is a completely mistranslation. They got the entire idea actually kind of wrong. So we have to be very careful. That's why we have to be very careful about translating cultural words, because cultural words is not simply a word. It's a context, it's a concept. We have to understand why the term actually was coined like that, or why Bhuta Radhane, it's a combination of two terms, why it is combined, and why it is combined actually, and to mean what. Unless we understand something, simply by going Bhuta means something or Aradhana means something, we cannot simply translate it. It will be completely mistranslation. And it will be injustice also. So, again, I mean, see another example. Like this is a very, I mean, I find it very interesting. This kinship words. This is also a cultural word. How you translate kinship words? For in English, for sister, there are two kinds of sister. There is only one word sister. Then you can actually, I mean, categorize as elder sister or younger sister. Assamese, there are two words. Hindi, there are two words like that. But for uncle, I have four words in Assamese. One maternal uncle, elder maternal uncle, younger maternal uncle, elder paternal uncle, younger maternal uncle, and all of them has to perform some kind of social duties or ritualistic duties. Like sometimes I find it very problematic if I am translating an English text that actually talks about uncle. I find it very problematic to translate, because to translate I need to find out which uncle he is, because I have four uncles in Assamese. If I simply write uncle, it may not mean anything. Yeah, there is a word called uncle in Assamese, but that is a very generic word. It may mean any one of the four uncles. Because uncle is socially very important, ritually very important, because in you know that in some society, uncle actually performs some very specific social duties. Like in some societies, they do the kanyadan, right? So in such kind of situation, we need to understand which uncle he is. But English text or some other language text where there is only one or two uncle, or uncle itself is not very much, I mean, ritualistically or socially important, it may not have more words. So this is a very tricky thing to find out. And when we do that, actually, next slide also we'll talk about that only. Let's see about that. See, this uncle thing, this idea of joking relationship, I have taken this screen from the Structure and Function in Primitive Society by Redcliffe Brown. In anthropology, there is a concept called joking relationship. What is joking relationship? You can see the definition here. I can simply say in a single line that this is a relationship through which a person is allowed to misbehave or make fun with another one. And it may be either unidirectional or bidirectional. Here it is saying symmetrical or asymmetrical. Okay. So, like what happens in my society, Assamese, I can take more I can make more fun with my mama, right? My mother's brother, he should be mother's brother, especially mother's younger brother, not the elder one. For me, I don't know, for you, it may be slightly different here and there. I can make more fun with him. I can go here and there. I can demand anything from him. I can tease him. Or even as a child, we are actually allowed to make more fun with the grandfather's generation. Like my grandfather or grandmother, I can make fun, I can play, but the same kind of fun and independency or that kind of leverage I cannot take with my father and mother. And like that with mama, whatever I can do, I cannot do that with my uncle, father's side. Paternal uncle, I cannot do the similar thing. It may be kind of problematic. It is not socially acceptable. Again, that another area of Sali, right? I'm sure in so many parts in India, actually, Sali, you can kind of, with Sali, sister-in-law, you can have a very, funny relationship. So these kind of things, when a text will be talking about these kind of kinship words, sister-in-law, mama, especially the maternal uncle, or even the grandfather and grandmother, the tone of the language or the will be completely different. And if this kind of joking relationship exists in one, like if source language it is there, target language it is not there, you need to do something to balance it out. Otherwise, if you say something which is not acceptable, socially acceptable in your society, then it may be problematic. The text, the translation may not be accepted. Or if those things are not there in the source culture, but it is there in the target culture, then also we have to make some kind of balance. We have to make some kind of changes. Maybe we have to kind of do some kind of adaptation if the text permits us to actually more acceptable socially or ritualistically more acceptable to the audience, to the readers. So there will be debates, whether we can change it, whether we should change it or not. But anyway, those kind of debates will always be there. Then localization and culture. This now actually this kind of ideas that how a text need to be adopted or need to be translated, it has to actually do a lot to do with the acceptance among the readers. That's why the whole new concept of localization came. Now they make a product, and that product they want to sell all over the world. They want a global market. So a product is created in America or a Japan or a China, they want to sell it in India, Indonesia, Nepal, Bangladesh, Bhutan, everywhere they want to sell it. So they need to make some changes in those products. And that changes or that customization is called localization. So if you want to see that, I picked up this part, second part, from a Microsoft localization style guide. So they are actually giving kind of suggestion or laying out the boundaries for the people who will be localizing their product, how to approach it. So they say that if you find something that can be unacceptable for a target user, then you need to change it, like date format, like how the language tone. Like English, you see, English, if you said it you means you, nothing else. But if I translate it to Hindi or Assamese, then I have a lot of problem. You may mean three things: up, tum, or tu. So I have to choose the tone, language tone, which it should be honorific, non-honorific, what kind of thing. Or I'll simply use tum, it will be kind of somewhat balanced. So all those things I have to decide, which may not be there in the source thing. And in localization, all these things will be taken care of. That's why now localization becoming a very, very popular when a company want to sell or market their product across the globe. So I'll finish it, not much, maybe last one slide. This quote I like, that's why I picked it up. So it says that all translations seem to me simply an attempt to solve an impossible task. Every translator is doomed to be done in by one of the two stumbling blocks. He will either stay too close to the original at the cost of the taste and the language of his nation, or he will adhere too closely to the characteristics peculiar to his nation at the cost of the original. The medium between the two is not only difficult but downright impossible. So that's what I am saying. I was also told by so many people, okay, take a balance approach, balance both source and target. But that is not possible, as Wilhelm von Humboldt also saying that we'll have to either choose to be close to the source, thereby sacrificing the convenience of the readers of the target text, or we should forget about the source text and concentrate on the meaning and try to transfer what the source says to the target by adding or maybe taking more liberties, adding cultural elements and language specific characteristics. So we have to choose as a translator. There is no other way. We cannot simply balance it. It will not be possible. We'll come to the last slide. Then I talked about Sheena Iyengar. She had a very interesting TED talk. So you can, of course, check that in TED website. So in the TED talk, she was quoting Robert Frost and Joseph Brodsky. Robert Frost, we all know. Robert Frost said that poetry lost in translation. This is a very famous quote from Robert Frost. But there is another writer, another poet, Joseph Brodsky. Joseph Brodsky may not be very famous, he may not be as famous as Robert Frost, but Joseph Brodsky was also a Nobel laureate. Joseph Brodsky says that it is the poem who gain in translation. So just two opposing ideas. Robert Frost says that poetry lost in translation, and Brodsky says that poetry gains in translation. So Sheena Iyengar actually explains it further. When it comes to choice, we have far more to gain than to lose by engaging in many translations of the narratives. Instead of replacing one story with another, we can learn from and reveal in the many versions that exist and the many that have yet to be written. No matter where you are from and what your narrative is, we all have a responsibility to open ourselves up to a wider area of what choice can do and what it can represent. And this doesn't lead to a paralyzing moral relativism. Rather, it teaches us when and how to act. I am sure you will agree agree to it, because it is not that there can be one version of translation of a one source text. There will be multiple versions of translation, and all translations are correct. Yeah, something may be linguistically wrong, grammatically wrong, spelling mistake, those things are fine. But I read a text, and when I translate, definitely my ideological elements will be reflecting in the translation. So if you pick up the same text, you translate it, and your ideology will be some or other way. It will be reflected in the text. It is bound to happen. Yeah, knowledge text, it may not happen. If you are translating a chemistry or physics text, you don't have scope to do that. But if it is a literature, a poem, a novel, it bound to happen. So that's why we will not be actually, I mean, measuring it, or will not be commenting like, okay, this is correct, this is incorrect, this is wrong, this is right, this should have been done, this should not have been done. These kind of things are very relative. So those are not correct, those are not appropriate, because one source text can be I mean, elaborate, it can be interpreted in many ways. So there is no limit to it. So anyway, I'll finish it with a 1-minute joke. This joke also has to do something with this idea of actually having many narratives and accepting all the narratives, and not judging actually anybody based on their narratives. Okay, so joke goes this way. Actually, once in a pub, one American, one Chinese, and one Indian were sitting and having a glass of beer. So American, suddenly some beer fell on his iPhone, and then Indian was saying that, oh, friend, your some beer fell down on your iPhone. Then he said, no, not a problem. These things are very common for us. America is very much advanced countries, technologically we have done wonders. Then Indians asking, what you have done, you tell me recently. I mean, what is your biggest achievement, recent biggest achievement? Then American said that, recently our scientist has actually worked out a way to build bridge. What we do, we start building a bridge from both the side, and our calculations and our procedures are so accurate. Then we start building from both the side, and then we meet in the middle, and we get a perfect bridge. There's no issue of measurement and no issue with the quality. It's a perfect bridge. So that saves time and energy, everything. So we built it like that. Then Chinese, Chinese are not actually far behind in technology. In fact, they are one step ahead of the Americans. Then he said, no, this is nothing. In China, to now we build bridge in completely different way. Then American asked how. Then he said, we start from the middle. Then we start building both the side, and we reach both the shore, and we get a nice bridge. Then this Indian friend was actually waiting. Then he was telling that, okay, see, India, we are not like you. What we do, we also build bridge. We start building bridge from both the side. Then what happens? The bridge doesn't meet in the middle. But we don't stop building bridges. We keep building till we reach the other side. And therefore, we always get two strong, beautiful bridges. So my friends, keep building bridges. We all will have different opinions. So difference in opinion doesn't matter, but we always should learn how to respect others' perspective also. That is more important in translation. Thank you.